Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Andrea Weckerly, and welcome to the Ready Living Podcast, where each episode is designed to educate, inspire, and empower you to create the life you want. Thanks for joining us, and remember to subscribe for free on your favorite platform. My guest today is Tom Raftery, a preeminent sustainability and technology executive, influential podcast host of the highly regarded Climate Confident and Resilient Supply Chain podcasts, and a recognized thought leader. In addition to being an influential international keynote speaker, he is a guest lecturer at the Instituto Internacional San Telmo, board advisor for various startups, and former global vice president at SAP. Prior to joining SAP, he built a successful career as an independent industry analyst, focusing on the Internet of Things, energy, and clean tech, while also serving as a futurist for Gerd Leonhardt's Futures Agency. With an extensive background in technology and social media dating back to 1991, Tom has co-founded an Irish software development company, a social media consultancy, and the hyper-energy efficient data center Cork Internet Exchange. He has made significant contributions to the field of sustainability through his work as an analyst at industry analyst firm RedMonk, where he led the sustainability practice for over 7 years. His unique blend of expertise and experience makes him a sought-after thought leader in technology, sustainability, and social media. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me on the pod.
Between your Climate Confident podcast with over 245 episodes and your Resilient Supply Chain podcast with over 475 episodes, you've had deep conversations with innovators and leaders. Tell us why you decided to focus on the business side of things as a crucial leveler for change.
I guess it comes down to the fact that businesses chase money, and at the same time, they have the large businesses at least, have a huge footprint. And if they can be convinced that it makes money to be more sustainable, which it does, then that footprint starts to become lighter in terms of its energy footprint, its CO2 footprint, etc. Business in general are the largest source of emissions and pollution, etc., globally. So getting them to change their ways is going to be crucial, hence why I chase it down. Most organizations now are starting to realize or have realized that being sustainable is actually good for business on a number of different fronts. What we're seeing right now is a rollback in messaging around climate, and I place the blame for that squarely at the current US administration and their war on ESG. Having said that, what we're seeing in business is most organizations are rowing back from their language around ESG and sustainability, but they're continuing in most cases with their actions. They're just changing how they're messaging what they're doing. So, for example, my Resilient Supply Chain podcast that you mentioned has recently rebranded as the Resilient Supply Chain Podcast. Up until a couple of weeks ago, it was the Sustainable Supply Chain Podcast. Why the rebrand? A number of organizations that I was talking to were uncomfortable going ahead on the podcast under that brand. Changed the title from Sustainable Supply Chain Podcast to Resilient Supply Chain Podcast, and suddenly I have a queue of people who want to come on the podcast and talk about the same things they were going to talk about under the Sustainable Supply Chain Podcast branding. But now, if they don't use the word sustainable, but they're still talking about their efficiency projects and things like that and how that's making them more resilient, i.e. sustainable, that's fine. So a lot of it is messaging, in business at least.
That's fascinating.
I mentioned that organizations need to realize that sustainability is analogous as well to being profitable. Sure, some of the projects will require some investment, but it's actually a way of reducing costs long term and being more profitable. I was talking to a guy called Ken Pucker in one of the podcasts. Ken is the former COO of Timberland. And he was CEO of Timberland when they started doing their emissions reporting first back in the early 2000s. And at the time, no one else was doing it. And he said when they would advertise vacancies in the organization, the applicants they got the level of applicants they got was far, far higher than should have been the case for those roles because Timberland was seen as a company that had a good sustainability story to tell. So his point was that if you do have a good sustainability story to tell, your costs of recruitment and retention go way down. And those are big costs for any organization. So getting those down is important and will lead to bottom line savings.
These companies are drawing in qualified hires because of their sustainability practices. Is this for early career hires or across the board?
Across the board. It's not just getting them in, it's keeping them in. So the retention is just as important as well, because if they get in and they find out the company is doing things that are a bit unethical or whatever, and they say, nope, I'm out, I'm going somewhere else because they've got a better sustainability story. And it's more the case with the younger employees, the Gen Zs and et cetera, who look at this as a higher priority than previous generations. And it's not just employees, it's also the cost of customer acquisition, because customer acquisition as well as a cost. Getting and keeping customers is easier if you have a good sustainability story to tell. So again, it's another win. There are lots of other things. There's as well the cost of capital. Very often, if you are going on a project and if there are fossil fuels associated with that project, the cost of capital for that is going to be high. Whereas if it's a project for reducing emissions, the cost of capital of that will be low. And the reason for that is because banks are starting now to have to report the emissions associated with their loan books. If they're giving money to something that is high emissions, it's going to cost them. You got to think as well, Paris 2015, the US has dropped out, but every country, apart from the US, and I hope that's temporary, has to reduce its emissions. So if you are building a gas-fired power plant today, typically those plants are built for a 30 to 50 year lifespan. So the return on investment has to be factored over that 30 to 50 years. But if we've decided that we're going to go globally net zero by 2050, that's a maximum of 25-year lifespan that gas plant has. So suddenly you're talking about a lot of stranded assets. And if you are a bank funding that over a 30 to 50-year life and it's got a 25-year life, cost of capital goes up because it's riskier.
Doesn't seem like the best investment then.
Correct. And similar for insurance companies. There's this concept of the carbon bubble. We have said that we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C or 2 degrees C at worst over our 1990 baseline. We signed off on that in 2015 in Paris globally. We're currently at about 1.1. And we know that to get from where we are today to 1.5 degrees C or 2 degrees C, we can figure out exactly how much CO2 we need to emit into the atmosphere to get to that 1.5 and then that 2 degrees C. Turns out, I'm going to round the numbers here because they change year on year. It turns out to get to, from where we are today to 2 degrees C is about 1,000 gigatons of CO2, 1,000 billion tons. That's a very abstract number, but to put some kind of context around it, the proven reserves of the fossil fuel companies and countries is 3,000 gigatons. These are the reserves that they have proven are there in the ground waiting to be dug up. Because these are proven reserves, this is what their loan book is based on. It's what their capitalization, their valuation is based on. So for them, either they're worth that 3,000 gigatons of CO2 and they destroy the planet, or we stick to that 2 degrees C, which is 1,000 gigatons, and they have to write off 66% of their value. You can see with that carbon bubble that's there, we're talking trillions of dollars of stranded assets. You can see why the fossil fuel companies are fighting tooth and nail to make sure that we get as many of their gigatons into the air as possible.
Especially in the United States.
Yeah. I mean, this is why they spent millions to go to that dinner in Mar-a-Lago before the election per head so that they could buy a president. He could tear up Paris and go all out on fossil fuels.
You've spent years helping companies recognize, as you just said, that sustainability isn't just an existential imperative, it's also a business opportunity. And that, to me, makes it all the more concerning that for a long time, there have been powerful interests that have worked to blur that reality and shift responsibility from climate action on part of companies to consumers. And so, for example, a 2021 peer review study, The Role of Public Relations Firms in Climate Change Politics, it was published in Climate Change, highlighted how a few large PR firms, I'm not going to name them, it's most of the big ones, are engaged in climate and energy political activity. And one of the co-authors noted that PR firms are a big part of the corporate propaganda machinery that guides the way people think about the issues, and that these firms help shape the public perception by coining terms such as clean coal and renewable natural gas to paint continued fossil fuel in a positive light, the antithesis of what you just described. And these campaigns have also worked to shift attention and responsibility from systemic industry-wide emissions towards individual consumer behavior. So my question to you is, how do we keep the focus on industry and policy actions amidst this intentional confusion?
It's a good question, and I wish there was an easy answer. I mean, you talk about them coining the phrase renewable natural gas. They coined the phrase natural gas. The real name is methane. They started calling it natural gas, so it would sound natural. PR firms have got a lot to answer for. They really, really do. And they need to be held to account. There's a lot of climate litigation that's happening right now. The last time I checked, there was about 3,000 cases globally of climate litigation taking place, and they're starting to have an impact. I'm not aware yet of any of the PR firms being put on the hook for their messaging, but it's only a matter of time because a lot of the larger companies, the airlines, have been taken to court. CPG companies have been taken to court for greenwashing. It is going to filter down. The PR companies in particular are going to start to be held to account as well. And the sooner that happens, frankly, the better. Because their collaboration with the fossil fuel companies, it's done enormous damage to sow doubt. If we go back 40 years, back to the 1980s, there was no doubt in anyone's mind. Global warming was a thing that was happening. And even the fossil fuel companies, it was their scientists who highlighted it. And suddenly their scientists got fired and they started buying politicians and they started putting in delaying tactics and they started sowing doubt.
So what do you think brought that on? Do you think it was the fact that talk around the importance of climate was becoming so successful that, let's say, energy companies wanted to make sure they didn't go overboard in terms of the success of their messaging? Or what brought this about?
It was an existential threat to their business. And they said, okay, we don't have an alternative. We either fold up shop and go home, but we have a fiduciary responsibility to our shareholders. We can't do that. So let's go all out and take on these PR firms to smear the scientists and smear the science and sow doubt. The exact same tactics that the cigarette companies did in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. Exact same playbook.
Yeah, the cigarette companies, what they did, especially in terms of trying to get women to smoke, was to make cigarette smoking a sign of freedom and individuality. And that's a message that resonates particularly in the United States. Your freedom of choice. You're not going to let somebody tell you what to do. And lo and behold, cigarette smoking rose. Do you see something like that similarly playing out?
A lot of the messaging around fossil fuels is not dissimilar. Freedom of choice. It's around no one tells me I can't drive my whatever it is, that kind of thing. The vast majority of fossil fuels come from petrostates with authoritarian leaders. And by buying fossil fuels, you're propping them up. By switching to renewables, you're getting locally sourced energy. And so in the event of a price shock like we had in the 70s, for example, or here in Europe in 2022, the invasion of Ukraine, we had the gas prices go flying up. Renewables are stable. As businesses, you can get power purchase agreements of 25 and 30 years, no problem. There are plenty of installers who will do that. They'll build you a renewable power plant with batteries so you get 24/7 renewable power. And they'll tell you the price of your energy for the next 25 or 30 years will be this many cents per kilowatt hour, guaranteed. Why more companies are not doing that, I have no idea, because it's generally cheaper than buying electricity off the grid. It's guaranteed. It's not going to fail. You won't have any outages. You'll have a guaranteed price. You can plan ahead. It's clean because it's from renewables, so you can use this in your marketing. There are so many ticks, as I said earlier, because it adds to your sustainability story. Your recruitment and retention costs go down. Customer recruitment costs come down as well. Cost of capital for this project is going to be low because it's a renewable project. Your insurance costs come down, et cetera, et cetera. If you are a manufacturing company and you're swapping out a gas boiler for a heat pump, for example, your cost to do that comes down, your emissions come down. And it's so advantageous for the company that the whole sustainability story, why it hasn't gotten further, has to be down to the fact that the PR companies have made it look more expensive or a bad idea or unreliable, because it's putting in danger the livelihoods of these authoritarian leaders or these billionaires. I mean, the fossil fuel companies are the most profitable companies in the history of mankind.
Mankind ever.
Ever. And that's in threat. Renewables threaten that. And so they spend hundreds of millions a year just on messaging that renewables are bad and fossil fuels are fantastic.
To the detriment of humans and every single life force on Earth. Writer and activist Rebecca Solnit said a couple of months ago that propping up fossil fuel is like propping up white supremacy. The future of the human race is renewable energy. You can batter it and try to roll time backwards, but you can't in the long term stop the renewal revolution. And her point speaks to the scale of change underway, and that shift is starting to show up in the numbers. And in an October 8th, 2025 article on your website, you wrote, in the first half of 2025, clean power didn't merely grow, it overtook coal in global generation for the first time in history. Solar and wind produced more electricity than coal, with solar alone covering 83% of the rise in global demand, a pivot from promising to prevalent. I love that. I was so encouraged when I read that. And yet, skeptics claim that decarbonization is unaffordable and unrealistic. And you've said that the way to get around some of this is to use language that moves them on security and affordability. So what are some of the biggest misconceptions skeptics have about the sustainability as a business driver? Because it seems to me to make no sense based on what you were just sharing.
It's exactly that. A lot of the FUD that's put out there about sustainability and about renewables is they're expensive, or the other great one that's often used is the sun doesn't always shine or the wind doesn't always blow. It's all rubbish. First of all, 20 years ago, and long before that, for the decades before that, solar and wind were more expensive than fossil fuels. But you've got this fantastic, this beautiful virtuous circle that has come in those last 20 years, where as more solar and wind are deployed, the learning curve means that their production becomes cheaper and more efficient. And so the price falls. And so they become more attractive to more people. So more is rolled out. And so the learning curve kicks in. And so the price drops, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this has happened year on year on year for the last over 20 years. So the price of solar and wind are falling between 10, 15, sometimes up to 20% per year. The same is happening with battery storage for storing that energy. And now, in a lot of cases, in a lot of geographies, it's cheaper to roll out solar backed up by batteries than it is to roll out gas or coal plants. And in some cases, it's even cheaper to roll out renewable plants than it is to keep existing fossil plants operating because of the fuel costs versus the one-off cost of the rollout. There's a number of things that are really fascinating about rolling out a renewable energy plant, be it solar, be it wind. Those are the two main ones, really. First of all, they're much cheaper now to roll out, as I mentioned, than any fossil fuel plant. The second is they're a lot faster to roll out. You want to roll out a gas-fired power plant, you're talking with permitting and environmental impact assessments and et cetera, 5, 6, 7, 8 years from plans on a drawing board to electricity going onto the grid. With wind, solar, you're talking 2 to 3 years. So A, it's much faster to deploy.
By far.
Exactly. And B, it's much cheaper to deploy. And C, as I mentioned in one of my blog posts recently, it's a lot more secure. It's typically much more decentralized. One of the interesting things that has come out, and Bill McKibben wrote about this recently, and I mentioned that in the blog post, one of the interesting things that's come out of the war in Ukraine is the Ukrainians are taking this opportunity to destroy the Russian oil terminals and refineries, and they're selectively taking them out. They're sending drones in 2,000 kilometers behind Russian lines and taking out these refineries. They're doing more for the Russian net zero targets than Putin ever would.
Oh my goodness.
What this tells you is these refineries, these big substations, in some cases, these power plants are massive targets. You take them out and you destroy for quite a long time because it takes a good while to get them back up and running again, particularly with the sanctions that are in place in Russia. One properly placed cruise missile, or Flamingo as the Ukrainian one's called, dropping into an oil terminal or a refinery can take it offline for years and has a huge impact on Russia's oil output. It's estimated now that about 30 to 40% of Russia's refining capacity has been destroyed. Whereas you send a cruise missile into a solar farm and you'll take maybe 100 kilowatts offline temporarily. I say temporarily because the cost of panels and getting them back in to replace the ones that have been destroyed is negligible. So you might take, like I say, 100 kilowatts of a 1 megawatt solar farm offline for a month or two, but it'll be back up and running again in no time. It's a lot more secure form of energy. But if you think as well in terms of the countries in the Caribbean or the South Pacific, who are often impacted by hurricanes, typhoons, etc., if they have a refinery that's taken offline or a port where oil or gas might be shipped in, if they're taken out, a typhoon or a hurricane might do some temporary damage to a solar farm, but it'll be a lot faster to get it back up. Because it's distributed as well over a larger area and over more sites. You don't have one central site that if it's taken offline, you've lost everything. You have lots of smaller sites around the place distributed, which again, give you more resilience to your power infrastructure. It makes it far more resilient. It makes it far more secure. It makes it far cheaper. I mentioned one of the arguments used is the sun isn't always shining and the wind isn't always blowing. Well, that's obviously rubbish. If the sun ever stopped shining, we'd be in serious trouble. The sun is always shining 24/7 and the wind is always blowing. Now, the sun is always shining, not always in the same place, obviously, but this is why you have storage. The cost of deploying solar plants now, which are backed up by batteries, or wind farms that are backed up by batteries, is negligible, and it's on a par now with rolling out fossil fuel plants. So there's no argument there for that. And we've seen it in Australia has rolled out enormous amounts of battery power. California as well. It's firming up the grid in California. What a lot of the batteries in California are doing now is they're taking in the energy at the peak times of generation during the day, and then they're releasing it in the evening when people come home from work and the sun is not as high. And so it's reducing the amount of gas that's required when there isn't as much solar being deployed. Instead of coming from gas, it's coming from the batteries that charge during the day. And that's typical. That's the typical kind of way now that batteries are stepping in. And as the price drops even further, what you'll find then is that the batteries now, which typically will have about a 4-hour duration, as the price drops more, it'll become more economic to roll out maybe 6 to 8 hour duration. Over time, it'll start to be 12-hour duration and even 24-hour duration or even weekly duration, depending on the types of technologies that are used to store the energy.
You have said that the center of gravity in clean industry has shifted, namely that China is now scaling clean tech like it once scaled steel and smartphones, and that Europe is busy turning climate law into industrial law, but that the United States has yanked the handbrake. My question to you is, what lessons should other countries take from this divergence? And what are the real consequences if the United States, which is still a superpower, continues to pull back on climate action?
I'm reminded of Nokia 2008, 2009, 2010. Nokia were a superpower in the cellular market. Apple released iOS and the iPhone. Google released Android. Nokia doubled down on their Symbian operating system and everyone went, bye. That's exactly what's happening today in the energy space. We have China particularly doubling down on the production of clean technologies, be it EVs, be it electric buses, be it electric trucks, be it solar panels, be it parts for wind turbines, nacelles, all these kind of things. They're producing that initially for themselves, but now because they've got the expertise, they're producing it for everybody. They're selling it in Latin America, they're selling it in Africa, they're selling it in Europe. I saw a report a few weeks back now talking about how global emissions in 2024 were 1% lower because of Chinese exports in 2024. So the Chinese exports of clean technologies reduced global emissions in 2024 1%. And those exports are only increasing. It's stunning, absolutely stunning what they're doing. In 2024, roughly 580 gigawatts of renewables were deployed globally. And that accounted for about 90% of all new energy rolled out. So globally, it was a little over 600 gigawatts of new electricity generation rolled out. Of that, 580 was renewables. And that's because of what we talked about earlier. It's because it's cheaper, it's faster, et cetera, et cetera. The energy companies, they are concerned about their emissions, yes, but they're more concerned about their bottom line. And so this is why they're rolling out renewables, because it's faster and cheaper. So of that 580 gigawatts, just to put that in context as well, because gigawatts, again, can be an abstract term for people, the output of a nuclear reactor is typically around 1 gigawatt. So 580 gigawatts of renewables rolled out in 2024. So of that 580, roughly 60% of that was in China. So China deployed more renewables, more solar in 2024 than the rest of the world combined. And the same with wind. What they're doing is incredible to reduce their emissions, but also what it means is they are industrializing it to the point where they'll be able to export not just the technologies, but also the expertise. So they'll be sending their engineers abroad to help with projects for rollouts in other countries. And it's happening at a time when the US is rolling back, not just on the projects in the US and the incentives in the US, but also in funding projects outside of the US with the development banks and US aid. Now the Chinese are going, this is fantastic. So the US is no longer getting involved in projects that have anything to do with renewables. Chinese are going, this is fantastic. We can get all our soft power now with no competition. Everyone's going to love us. We'll walk in and we'll help them build their renewable power plants and zero competition there. I don't know, is it short-sighted or is it actually deliberate? I honestly don't know.
If it were deliberate, Tom, then one would have to wonder what the so-called benefit is. I mean, obviously maximize profits for let's say, the oil and gas companies. But at some point, that will cease. It seems like extremely irrational thinking.
All these billionaires are building their bunkers.
On their islands.
They know what's coming and they've got the money to ride it out.
Speaking of big companies, not oil and gas now, but other big companies, in September of 2025, you wrote an article called Big Tech, Big Promises, Big Emissions. And you made the sharp point that while tech companies like Google and Microsoft have made commendable progress on renewable energy procurement, the same sector is also helping fossil fuel companies pump hydrocarbons more efficiently with AI and enterprise software. And then you went on to say that that's climate leadership with one hand and climate sabotage with the other. You basically say that the tech sector has the tools, talent, and capital to be a force for good in the energy transition, but tech is also a culprit. And then you start naming names. More names. You say companies like Oracle, Microsoft, SAP, your former employer, and Salesforce actively sell software that helps oil and gas companies optimize drilling, exploration, and production. That's not neutrality, it's complicity. It's like a firefighter boasting about how many fires they put out while running a thriving business selling matches and petrol. Ouch. So, should companies that actively enable fossil fuel expansion even be allowed to call themselves climate leaders, as they often do in their marketing materials?
The obvious short answer to that is no.
No.
It is something that they do need to be called out about. Every time now any of these big tech companies laud their climate initiatives, there has to be somebody in the room saying, how many fossil fuel companies are customers of yours? What is it you're doing for them? How much are you making from fossil fuel companies every year? Because it's going to be a very uncomfortable conversation. Because they are making each hundreds of millions in software sales to fossil fuel companies. And it is to do exactly what I said there in the article. It is to enable them to more efficiently destroy the planet. You can't be doing that. You can't be, on the one hand, saying, we're fantastic, we've reduced our emissions 15% in the last 10 years, and on the other hand, helping the fossil fuel companies more efficiently destroy the planet. It's the height of hypocrisy.
Well, by the same token, you're very critical of corporate climate pledges, and you say that they sound impressive but are little more than smoke and mirrors. What are the most common weaknesses that you see in corporate climate pledges? Maybe it's simply that they're lying. What would real integrity look like?
This is one of those it depends answers.
Yeah, it depends on what company we're talking about.
A lot of companies between 2015 and 2020, a lot of them made very laudable pledges saying they were going to be net zero by 2030 and they were going to be climate negative by 2035 or 2040 or whatever. Since then, they've rolled back on some of those pledges because A, AI, and B, it's hard. It's easy to make a pledge, but it's a lot more challenging to actually go, oh crap, now how do we actually roll this out? And put a plan in place to actually meet that pledge. The third thing that a lot of companies are doing is they are buying their way to some of those targets with offsets.
And I've heard that offsets don't really do anything.
Again, it depends. Offsets should be the very, very, very last resort if you use them at all. And if you do have to use them, which you may in some situations for some processes, which are incredibly hard to abate, if you do, you need to be 200% sure that these offsets are not something like a forest in Indonesia, which gets blown over in the next typhoon that rolls through, or burns in a wildfire. These need to be offsets that have millennial permanence in them, the likes of sequestering CO2 geologically, so that the time frame, as I say, is measured in millennia, not in decades. And a lot of those forestry ones are decadal, if even that. So offsets, there are cases where they're necessary, but it should be very last resort, and you need to be extremely careful in the types of offsets you do use if you have to use them.
We've been talking about how in order to have maximum impact, focus needs to be on industry action rather than on what individuals necessarily are doing. Yet a caveat to this is perhaps illustrated by Oxfam's Climate Plunder Report that notes that since the Paris Agreement in 2015, the richest 1% of people, the ones that you were mentioning, are building their bunkers, and I added the islands onto that. The richest 1% of people in the world have burned through more than twice as much of the remaining carbon budget than the poorest half of humanity combined. So how do you think we should balance the conversation between individual responsibility and systemic industry level change when it comes to this 1%? And how do we keep one from distracting the other? People very often look at what leaders are doing, or they look at what wealthy people are doing, or they think this is an aspirational life to have. And if this 1% is doing things that's categorically and consistently very, let's put it this way, climate unfriendly, we should be pointing to them, even if the greater emphasis needs to be on what industry does.
You're familiar with the term personal carbon footprint?
Yes.
So the company that came up with the term personal carbon footprint was BP. BP invented personal carbon footprint. And this goes back to our conversation about PR companies, because they did it in conjunction with PR companies to push and distract and make us feel responsible for their carbon footprint. So suddenly it's individuals and their lifestyle that's causing all the problems. Not the fossil fuel companies that are selling this stuff. It's the individuals who are using the products who are responsible for it.
My plastic straw.
Exactly. The idea of individual responsibility, sure, you have to be responsible. You have to take responsibility. You have to try and reduce your emissions, but that's not the issue. If I look around me here in my own house, I've got a solar array on the roof of the house I put in place in 2018. We're a single car family. Our car has been an EV since 2018.
Tesla?
Never. No, never owned a Tesla. Current car is an EV3, a Kia EV3. Everything in the house is electric, heating, cooking, cooling, everything. There's no fossil fuels that enter into this house. It makes me feel good. I haven't eaten beef since 2008. Again, meaningless in terms of the amount of gigatons of CO2 that are out there. What we need to be doing is, educate people on ways they can individually reduce their emissions, but we need to be systematically or systemically changing so that if they want to drive an EV, for example, that they have the infrastructure there to charge them wherever they want, and they have access to low-cost EVs, and they have access to low-cost public transport that's good and desirable. We need to change society so that it's easy and cheap and desirable to use low carbon alternatives.
And I think that goes back to a cultural understanding, though, then. And maybe that is where people do make a difference. I mean, obviously, you described your home. You and your family are doing everything you can. And I think that also speaks to your credibility then, because if you are out there talking about and evangelizing for renewables and so on and so forth, and then they say, well, Tom, what do you do at home? Well, don't tell anybody, but I really drive a gas-guzzling car. I'm all about oil and things like that. You would lose your credibility. So I think there is value in that. In Europe, for example, public transportation is baked into the way that cities are built. But when it comes to the United States, for example, yes, we have a train system to a certain extent, but it's very much a car-centric culture. And if you talk about public transportation, unless you're in metro areas like Boston, New York, or Chicago, or DC, it really does fall back on automobiles. And that's where I think then maybe appealing to a need for EVs would come more into play.
True. And I mean, you got to think as well, the reason why that is in the US is because back at the start of the 20th century, the car companies bought the public transportation and shut it down in a lot of cases. The trams in cities bought those tram companies and they tore up the rails. This isn't an accident. I mean, this was by design as well. I want to go back as well to another part of the previous question you had, and that was around how the top 10% of people globally cause over 50% of the emissions. The take I had on that at the time is kind of cynical, I guess, because you do from time to time hear people talking about the fact that the climate problem or the climate crisis is a population crisis. It's because there are too many people on the planet. And that's very often a racist dog whistle, because the people who make that argument are saying there are too many brown people in third world countries and that's what's causing the problem. Whereas in fact, if you look at the data from that report you highlighted, it's that top 1 to 10% of very rich people. So yes, it is a population problem. It's that top 1 to 10%. If we culled them, we'd reduce our emissions over 50% overnight.
We're not suggesting anybody be culled. You also recently said that for too long, climate change has been framed as an abstract moral crusade, and that kind of ties into what we're just talking about, but that climate change is first and foremost a risk management challenge. Is there a particular framework you can suggest for how executives or politicians practically think about climate risk?
If we think back to, I think it was 2011 was when the Syrian civil war kicked off and the Arab Spring. That was caused by climate change primarily. What happened there was you had farms failing and young people in rural areas migrating to cities because the farms failed, becoming unemployed, becoming poor. You had a civil war as a result. And so I won't say it was 100% caused by climate change, but I would say it was 60-70% caused by climate change. It was some of the biggest factors that caused that civil war. That caused a mass migration out of Syria into Europe, which had all kinds of knock-on consequences. 5 million or more Syrians came to Europe. We're looking conservatively in the next few decades at not 5 million refugees, but 3, 4, 500 million climate refugees, as sea level rise impacts low-lying countries like Bangladesh. I mean, the Netherlands is a low-lying country too, but they have the money and the technology to keep building higher dikes. Bangladesh and other countries, not so much. I heard it cynically said that Florida will turn blue as sea level rises.
I've heard something similar.
There will be all kinds of migration problems occurring. And if you have an anti-immigrant status or you think you have an immigration problem today, you just wait.
You just wait. Oh, my goodness.
And if you want to stop a flow of immigrants, maybe think about working on climate change.
I love that. make the conditions in their native countries livable and assist in that process so that there is no need to migrate to other parts of the world.
Yeah, exactly.
A lot of young people are out there taking part in movements like Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil and Insulate Britain. And they use civil disobedience to draw attention to the climate crisis. In your view, is such disobedience necessary climate action to help sway public opinion and inspire consumer actions, for example, to make wiser and more sustainable purchasing decisions, reduce overall consumption, adopt environmentally friendly lifestyle choices like alternatives to flying when possible or eating a more planet-friendly diet? Because going through traditional lobbying channels hasn't gotten politicians to sufficiently respond, or is it an ineffective and counterproductive distraction?
The very fact that we're having this conversation shows that it is the right thing for them to be doing. A lot of people get very emotional about the fact that they've gone into museums and thrown soup at Van Gogh's sunflowers and Rembrandt's in the Netherlands and things like that. But of course, had they damaged those paintings, that would have been negligence on the part of the museums that housed the paintings more so than the protesters themselves. The fact is they didn't damage any of them and knew they wouldn't and used paints that are water soluble that could wash off the walls and buildings that they threw paint at, for example. So they did no damage of any kind except to be a nuisance. And they got themselves headlines globally. You had news outlets and you had on social media, you had all these outraged people talking about all the terrible things these climate protesters were doing. And it meant people were talking about climate for the first time in a long time. Whether they were saying these people are terrible or whether they were saying this is fantastic, we need more of this, people were talking about climate. So it brought the conversation to the fore. They needed to do outrageous headline grabbing things, which had no permanent impact. Except on them, because their acts were criminalized in the UK where they did it, and now many of them are facing jail sentences, which is why it has actually stopped there now, because they've run out of volunteers, because they have about 1,000 people now awaiting sentencing. But they did nothing of any consequence, damage-wise. In fact, if we look back at peaceful protest or civil disobedience over the decades and centuries, we look at the likes of the suffragettes. What the suffragettes did would today be classed as terrorism, without any doubt. They bombed buildings. They set fire to properties. They committed suicide. Several of them ran out in front of racehorses and were killed in races attended by the king, etc. They were a violent group by today's standards, but they achieved their aims. What today's climate protesters are doing in comparison is very, very timid. And yet they've still managed to grab headlines. So kudos to them. Absolutely. And we need more of that.
There are many pressing issues in the world right now. The rise of authoritarianism, economic insecurity, threats to press freedom, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Many people feel overwhelmed by crises, and climate action can often feel abstract. So, what are some of the most effective ways to keep climate on the public and political agenda, aside from some of these protests that we just talked about, when attention is so fragmented? Certainly podcasts like you have, you are out there every single week, talking about this topic for years now.
We need to keep talking about it. We need as well to keep voting about it. We need our politicians to be aware that this is a priority for us, and we need to prioritize climate when it comes to where we put our tick in the voting booth. We need to look at the political parties and look at their climate aims or agendas or policies or whatever it is, and we need to say, okay, whatever else they're doing, this is the political party that has the best climate policies. That gets my vote. As we start to do that, the political parties should start taking notice. But we should also be telling them that this is what we're doing. We should be writing to our local representatives and saying, by the way, en masse, if possible, these are the things that are important for me. Make sure you talk about them in the upcoming election and make sure you do something about them if and when you do get elected.
I think that's very important. I want to talk about where people can get some of their information. In legacy news media in the United States, you've seen them increasingly bow to political pressure to minimize climate reporting. One of the leading American broadcasters, CBS News, fired most of the reporters who specialize in climate coverage, with the exception of one national environmental correspondent who no longer has a dedicated producer. So basically, the legs were cut out from under him. Where do you recommend people turn for reliable, solution-focused climate journalism? And again, your podcasts for sure. But in addition to that, are there any particular voices or outlets?
So yes, I have 2 podcasts. One is called Resilient Supply Chain. That goes out every Monday, 7 a.m. CET. It goes out on Apple, Google, Spotify, et cetera, all your typical podcast channels. So wherever you get your podcasts, search for Resilient Supply Chain. It'll pop straight up. The other one is called Climate Confident, and Climate Confident goes out every Wednesday, and it's one where I talk about successful emissions reduction stories and strategies. Both of them are interview-style podcasts where I interview successful leaders in the space talking about the things they're doing. Climate Confident every Wednesday, 7 a.m., and it goes out on Apple, Google, Spotify, et cetera, and on YouTube as well. I also write a lot. TomRaftery.com. My blog is there. And I have a newsletter that goes out every Thursday. It's a free newsletter and it's full of good news stories in the climate and sustainability space. I call it Future Proof. You can find the link to it on my blog, or you just go to newsletter.tomraftery.com. You'll find it there. Having said that, third-party sources that are great. The BBC isn't bad. They, from time to time, have good stories. The Guardian is very good. They generally have very good coverage of climate. Then if we go to some of the organizations, the International Energy Agency is always a good source. They released their World Energy Outlook 2025 report. It's a several 100-page document, but they have lots of other publications that come out regularly around the energy space. There's IRENA, I-R-E-N-A, that's the Renewable Energy Agency. They regularly put out reports. There's Carbon Brief, which is a great website. They have fantastic news and they have a great newsletter that goes out daily. You should definitely sign up to that. There's EMBER as well, E-M-B-E-R, another great organization that does a lot of reporting on stuff that's happening and in-depth reporting on stuff that's happening in the space. So those would be the main ones I'd recommend. They're really, really good. Because I write a lot on the blog and in the newsletter, you'll find more of the stories and the sources, because in every one of the stories I put into the newsletter, I link to the source as well.
That is very useful. And my last question to you is, after all your conversations with innovators, activists, and policymakers, what gives you the most climate hope heading into next year?
What gives me the most hope is the economics that we mentioned at the very start. It's the fact that renewables are now the default choice for energy companies, and the fact that it's getting cheaper and cheaper year on year on year.
Tom, thanks so much for having taken the time today.
Thank you, Andrea.